Welcome to a documentary experience defined by absolute transparency. We guarantee that the upcoming scenes are entirely unfiltered and unedited. This is raw, immersive footage from the front lines of justice, providing an unpolished look at those who uphold the law.
Sir, stop right there. Hands where I can see him.
Officer, I'm returning to TSA. I left an item at screening.
You don't just turn around back here. ID and boarding pass now.
I'm reaching slowly. You can watch my hand.
The officer's voice cut through the constant hum of the airport terminal. Sir, stop right there. The man froze, one hand still wrapped around the handle of his carry-on suitcase, the other holding a thin folder stamped with an eagle seal. The smell of jet fuel mixed with burnt coffee drifted through the air. Somewhere behind them, a loudspeaker announced a delayed flight. People kept walking, wheels of luggage rattling over tile, but the space around the two men felt suddenly tight and still. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked. His tone was calm, controlled, almost practiced. He stood straight, shoulders relaxed, not defensive, not submissive, just waiting. The officer stepped closer. "You just came through TSA, right? Where are you heading? Why did you turn around after the checkpoint?" His hand hovered near his radio fingers, tapping once, twice. The questions came fast, layered with suspicion that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with who was standing in front of him. "I realized I left something behind at the screening area," the man replied. "I was told to come back this way." His eyes moved briefly to the blue uniform, then back to the officer's face. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush his words. The officer frowned. "I need to see your identification and your boarding pass. Now." Around them, travelers began to slow. A woman with a stroller stopped pretending to check her phone. A businessman angled his body just enough to watch. Someone lifted a phone chest high, the camera lens barely visible. The airport was loud, but the tension between the two men seemed to swallow every other sound. The man nodded once. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, deliberate, precise. "Here is my ID." He handed over a federal identification card followed by his boarding pass. The officer glanced at them barely a second before his jaw tightened. "What kind of work do you do?" the officer asked. "I'm a judge," the man said. "Federal court." The officer let out a short, humorless breath. "Yeah, okay. Sir, turn around and place your hands where I can see them. Until we verify who you really are, you're being detained." The word detained hung in the air like a bad smell. The man did not move. His eyes narrowed not in anger, but in calculation. "Am I being accused of a crime?" he asked. "Accused of—" The officer did not answer. He reached for the man's arm. That was the moment the crowd reacted. Someone spoke up. "He hasn't done anything." Another voice followed. "This is after TSA. What's the issue?" The phones came up higher now. No one was hiding it anymore. The man finally turned his head slowly, taking in the scene. The badge, the cameras, the officer's clenched jaw. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was something else. Something older. Something dangerous. "Officer," the man said quietly, "you are making a serious mistake." The officer snapped back. "We'll see about that." And just like that, in the middle of one of the most secure places in America, a black man with a federal badge was treated like a threat, not because of what he did, but because of who someone thought he was. To understand why that moment at the airport unfolded the way it did, you have to rewind decades before the flashing phones and raised voices. Long before the badge, before the federal credentials, before the quiet authority in his tone. You have to go back to a narrow brick row house on the south side of Baltimore, where the man now standing under airport lights learned early that the world would question his right to exist in certain spaces. His name was Judge Marcus Ellison. He was born in 1971, the second of 3 children raised by a mother who worked nights as a nurse's aide and a father who drove a city bus for nearly 30 years. The house was small, the heat unreliable, but the rules were strict. Do your homework, speak clearly, never give anyone a reason to say you don't belong. By 12, Marcus understood that being smart was not enough. He had to be precise, controlled, better than expected. At 17, he earned a scholarship to a state university. At 24, he was one of 3 black students in his law school class. Professors mispronounced his name. Classmates assumed he was there on affirmative action. He learned to respond not with anger, but with preparation. He spoke only when he was certain. When he did, the room listened. After law school came federal clerkships, then years as a prosecutor handling complex appeals. Marcus built a reputation quietly. No theatrics, no ego, just airtight arguments and an unshakable respect for the Constitution. He argued cases involving unlawful searches, racial profiling, and abuse of power. He read transcripts late into the night. He wrote opinions that forced law enforcement agencies to change policy. He believed deeply in the idea that the law applied correctly could restrain prejudice. By 48, he was confirmed as a federal appeals judge, the kind of position that comes with lifetime tenure and immense responsibility. He oversaw cases that shaped how police conduct stops, how evidence is admitted, how civil rights are protected. He wore the robe, but never forgot the weight of being watched differently when he took it off. Now shift to the other side of that airport corridor. Officer Daniel Price had been with airport police for 11 years. He was known as proactive, alert, someone who trusted his instincts. His file showed multiple commendations for spotting suspicious behavior. It also showed complaints. Not enough to end his career. Just enough to form a pattern that no one formally named. Several travelers of color had accused him of unnecessary questioning, secondary screenings without cause, prolonged detentions justified by vague language. Each time, supervisors found no clear violation. Price knew how to write reports. He knew which words mattered. He believed he was keeping people safe. He also believed that hesitation was weakness. In training, he had been told that confidence could be faked. Credentials could be forged. Criminals adapted. Trust your gut. Over time, his gut learned the wrong lessons. Certain faces made him uneasy. Certain tones sounded rehearsed. Authority, when coming from someone who did not look like him, felt like a challenge. By the time Marcus Ellison walked back through that airport corridor, both men were carrying histories into the same moment. One had spent a lifetime proving his legitimacy. The other had spent a career questioning it. Neither of them said those truths out loud, but they were there, pressing against the air between them. And that is how a federal appeals judge fresh from a TSA checkpoint became a suspect in the eyes of a man trained to never doubt himself. The corridor outside the TSA checkpoint no longer felt like part of an airport. It felt like a stage. People slowed, then stopped. Shoes squeaked against polished tile. The rolling suitcases formed a loose semicircle around the scene, an unplanned audience drawn by tension they could feel before they fully understood it. Judge Ellison kept his hands visible, palms open, a lifetime habit. Officer Price stood half a step too close, close enough to assert control, close enough to intimidate. His radio crackled softly, a burst of static that went unanswered. He glanced at the federal ID again, longer this time, but still not long enough to read it carefully. "You said you're a judge," Price said. His voice had changed. Not louder, sharper. "Which court?" "The Federal Appeals Court," Ellison replied. His eyes stayed locked on the officer's face. He knew this moment, the pivot point. Where facts either mattered or they didn't. Price smirked slightly. "Appeals Court." "Right. And you expect me to just take that at face value?" "I expect you to read the identification you're holding," Ellison said. Price ignored that. He turned his body just enough to block Ellison's path. "I'm going to need you to step over here while we verify this." He gestured toward a blank wall near the corridor entrance. No signage. No seating. A place people were taken, not a place they chose. Ellison did not move. "Officer," he said evenly, "I have cleared TSA. I am not under arrest. If you are detaining me, I need to know the legal basis." The word legal landed hard. A few heads snapped up. One man in a gray hoodie whispered to the woman beside him, "This is getting serious." Another traveler raised her phone higher, no longer pretending to text. The red recording light reflected faintly in the officer's badge. Price felt it. The eyes, the attention. He straightened his shoulders. "Sir, I'm conducting an investigation." "You can cooperate, or this can go another way." "Another way." The phrase was vague, but everyone knew what it meant. Ellison exhaled slowly through his nose. He had written opinions about this exact tactic. Ambiguity used as leverage. Authority filling the gaps where law should be. "What exactly are you investigating?" Ellison asked. Price didn't answer. Instead, he reached for Ellison's arm. That was when voices broke the silence. "Hey, you don't need to grab him," someone said. "What did he do?" Another voice followed. Price snapped his head toward the crowd. "Step back. This is an active police matter." The crowd did not step back. If anything, it leaned in. A middle-aged woman spoke clearly, her voice steady. "We're recording, just so you know." Ellison turned his head slightly toward her. "Thank you," he said. Price's jaw tightened. His ears burned. He felt cornered, though he was the one in uniform. He had already gone too far to simply stop. Apologizing now would mean admitting error in front of witnesses, in front of cameras. He doubled down. "Sir, place your hands behind your back," Price ordered. "For what reason?" Ellison asked. "For failing to comply." Ellison's eyes hardened. "Not with fear, with resolve. Officer, asserting my rights is not a crime." Price reached for his cuffs. The sound of metal sliding free cut through the corridor like a warning bell. Phones were fully raised now. One man stepped closer, narrating under his breath. "Airport police detaining a guy after TSA? This is crazy." Ellison did not resist. He turned slowly, deliberately, as if every movement were being documented in his mind. As if he already knew this moment would matter later. As the cuffs closed around his wrists tight and cold, the crowd murmured. Some in shock, some in anger, some in recognition, because many of them had seen this before. And they knew how it usually ended. The click of the handcuffs was louder than it should have been. Metal against metal. Final. The sound echoed briefly off the tiled walls before being swallowed by the constant noise of the terminal. Judge Ellison felt the cold circle close around his wrist, felt the pressure tighten one notch too far. Not enough to injure, enough to remind him who had control. Officer Price guided him toward a side hallway reserved for airport security. His hand rested firmly between Ellison's shoulder blades, not pushing hard, but never easing up. Travelers parted instinctively, eyes wide, phones raised. A few shook their heads, others whispered. No one laughed. This was not entertainment. This was discomfort made public. Ellison walked without resistance. His posture stayed upright. His steps measured. Inside his mind was already working, cataloging details. Time, location, words used, hands placed. He noted the absence of any explanation, the lack of probable cause, the presence of witnesses. He had ruled on cases like this from the bench. Now he was living one. They passed a glass wall. Ellison caught his reflection. Gray hair at the temples, a tailored jacket now creased at the shoulders. A man who looked exactly like what he was, a federal judge. And yet here he was, treated as a threat in one of the most surveilled spaces in the country. Inside the small security office, the door shut with a dull thud. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale air. No windows. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and a mounted camera blinking red. Price positioned Ellison facing the wall. "Stay there," Price said. "Don't move." Ellison stood still. His wrists ached slightly. He flexed his fingers, testing circulation. Somewhere beyond the walls, flights were boarding. Families were reuniting. Life continued uninterrupted. Price stepped out briefly, radio pressed to his shoulder. His voice was low, urgent. "I've got a subject claiming to be federal judiciary. Need verification." The reply crackled back, unreadable. Ellison closed his eyes for a moment. Not in despair. In focus. He thought about the irony. The cases he had written condemning unlawful detention. The language he had chosen carefully, knowing it would guide future conduct. He wondered if Officer Price had ever read one of his opinions. If his name had ever appeared in Price's training materials. The door opened again. Another officer entered. Younger. Hesitant. He glanced at Ellison, then at Price. "What's the charge?" the second officer asked quietly. Price hesitated. "Noncompliance? Investigation ongoing?" Ellison turned his head slightly. "Officer," he said calmly, "I am being detained without cause. This is being recorded. I would advise you to verify my identity immediately." The younger officer swallowed. He looked at the federal ID still sitting on the desk. He picked it up. Really looked this time. His expression shifted, Price noticed. His shoulders stiffened. "Don't get distracted. Anyone can fake credentials." Ellison opened his eyes fully now. "You can call the clerk's office. The number is public. Ask for Chambers. They will confirm who I am." Silence settled in the room, heavy, pressurized. Outside, the video was already spreading. Captured from multiple angles. A black man in cuffs after TSA. Calm, assertive, ignored. Inside that small room, the injustice was complete. Not because of violence, not because of shouting, but because the law had been set aside, replaced by suspicion that refused to listen. And for the first time since the cuffs went on, Officer Price felt it. Not certainty, doubt. Too late! The door opened again slower this time. The kind of slow that comes after someone has checked something they did not expect to find. A supervisor stepped in, his rank insignia catching the fluorescent light. He took in the scene in a single glance. The cuffs, the wall, the blinking camera, the federal identification card lying face up on the desk. "What's going on here?" the supervisor asked. Officer Price spoke first. Subject refused to comply. Claims he's a federal judge. The supervisor picked up the ID. He did not skim it. He read it. Front, back. His brow furrowed slightly. He turned to Ellison. "Sir, can you state your full name?" Marcus Ellison said. "United States Court of Appeals." The supervisor nodded once, already reaching for the phone on his belt. He stepped aside, speaking quietly, deliberately. The call was short, too short to be reassuring for anyone else in the room. When he hung up, the atmosphere changed. Officer Price, the supervisor, said, "Keep your hands where I can see them." Price blinked. "Sir." The supervisor turned fully toward him now. The clerk's office confirmed his identity. "Judge Ellison is a sitting federal appeals judge." The words landed heavy, final. For a moment, no one moved. Price's face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked at Ellison, really looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. Not as a suspect, not as a challenge, but as a consequence. The supervisor spoke again. "Remove the cuffs, now." Price hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Then his hands fumbled with the key. The cuffs loosened. Fell away. Ellison rubbed his wrists once calmly. Red marks were already forming. "Judge Ellison," the supervisor said, "I apologize for this situation. You are not being detained." Ellison met his eyes. "I know," he said. His voice was steady, controlled. But something underneath had hardened. Outside the room, another officer peeked in. The phones were still out there. The video still recording. The moment had already escaped the walls. Price took a step back as if distance might protect him. "Sir, I didn't know," he started. Ellison cut him off. "That was never the issue." The supervisor swallowed. "We will be documenting everything. Internal review will follow." Ellison nodded once. "Good. I will be requesting all footage. Body cameras, security cameras, radio logs, immediately." The supervisor did not argue. "Yes, sir." As Ellison straightened his jacket, the weight of the reveal settled in. The badge, the title, the authority that should not have been necessary but suddenly was. Officer Price stood silent, staring at the floor. The certainty he had carried minutes earlier was gone, replaced by something colder. Realization, because the mistake was no longer hypothetical. It had a name, a face, and consequences that would not be ignored. And for the first time since the stop began, the power in the room had shifted completely. The video surfaced online before Judge Ellison even reached his gate. 3 angles. One from behind a suitcase, one held steady at chest level, one shaky but close enough to capture the sound of the cuffs. By the time his plane began boarding, the clip had already crossed 1 million views. By the time he landed, it was everywhere. Federal judge detained after TSA. Airport police handcuff appeals court judge. Profiling caught on camera. Ellison did not comment publicly. He did not need to. The footage spoke with a clarity no press conference ever could. Calm questions. No resistance, no threat. Just authority ignoring the law until confronted by a higher one. Within 48 hours, a federal civil rights lawsuit was filed. Precise. Unemotional. 27 pages outlining unlawful detention, violation of Fourth Amendment rights, and racial profiling under color of law. Each claim matched to a timestamp in the video. Each legal argument grounded in precedent Ellison himself had helped shape over the years. The airport police department placed Officer Price on administrative leave that same week. An internal affairs investigation followed, then another. Records surfaced quietly at first. Prior complaints, similar stops, similar language in reports, suspicion without substance. Each incident previously dismissed as discretionary judgment. This time discretion was no longer a shield. Public pressure mounted. Civil rights organizations demanded transparency. Legal scholars dissected the footage frame by frame on national television. Former judges spoke openly about how dangerous it was for law enforcement to ignore credentials and constitutional boundaries in secure federal spaces. The department released its findings 6 weeks later. Officer Price had violated protocol, failed to articulate reasonable suspicion, ignored de-escalation procedures, disregarded identification without cause. His employment was terminated. His certification was flagged. His career in law enforcement ended not with sirens, but with paperwork and silence. The city settled the lawsuit before trial. The amount was significant, though the number mattered less than the admission. Policy failures, training gaps, oversight ignored. Ellison directed the settlement funds to a legal defense organization specializing in wrongful detentions and airport profiling cases. In his only statement, he said this was never about compensation. It was about precedent. New policies followed. Mandatory verification of federal credentials, clear limits on post-TSA detentions, data audits tracking stops by race, changes that would not have existed without that one moment caught on camera. Officer Price faded from public view. No interviews, no statements, just a name attached to a lesson taught the hard way. Judge Ellison returned to the bench. Robe on, voice steady. He wrote again, this time with experience added to doctrine. Not anger, precision. Because justice, when it finally arrived, did not shout, it corrected. What happened in that airport corridor was not a misunderstanding. It was a textbook violation of constitutional law, the kind taught in first-year classrooms and repeated in courtrooms across the country. The Fourth Amendment is clear. A person cannot be detained without reasonable suspicion based on specific and articulable facts. Clearing TSA is not suspicious. Walking back through a corridor is not suspicious. Being calm, articulate, and confident is not suspicious. Reasonable suspicion is not a feeling. It is not a hunch. It is not discomfort. It requires observable behavior tied to a possible crime. In Judge Ellison's case, there was none. The detention continued anyway, escalating into handcuffs without probable cause. That is not policing. That is unlawful restraint under color of authority. There is also the issue of credential verification. Law enforcement officers are trained to verify, not dismiss. Federal identification carries legal weight precisely to prevent situations like this. Ignoring it is not caution. It is negligence. When an officer refuses to verify readily confirmable information, the law sees intent, not confusion. But law alone does not explain why this happens so often. Psychology fills the gap. Implicit bias operates quietly. It attaches assumptions to faces, tones, and bodies before conscious thought intervenes. When combined with authority, it becomes dangerous. The officer believes he is neutral. The data shows otherwise. Bias narrows perception. It filters evidence. It turns compliance into defiance and credentials into threats. For viewers, there are lessons that matter beyond outrage. If you are stopped, remain calm. Keep your hands visible. Ask one clear question. Am I being detained or am I free to go? Do not argue facts on the street. Document everything. If others are present, encourage recording. Video protects truth when memory is questioned. Know that asserting your rights is not obstruction. Silence is not guilt. Calm is not deception. And credentials, whether federal or civilian, do not remove your humanity or your protections under the Constitution. Judge Ellison's case ended with reform because power finally confronted itself. Most cases do not. That is why understanding the law matters. That is why recording matters. That is why refusing to judge people by appearance matters. Because justice does not begin in court. It begins in moments like that corridor when the law is either followed or ignored. Now the question is simple. If this can happen to a federal appeals judge, what does it mean for everyone else?
Driven by the pursuit of truth, our mission is to demand transparency and hold power to account. We trust in hard evidence because the records do not lie. Thank you for watching and staying informed.